In 70 years of debates, Socrates never lost a single one. Nietzsche dominated discussions using what he called hidden blades, and Marcus Aurelius controlled rebellious senators with his emotional armor. Today you will discover the 7 techniques that made these philosophers masters of any argument, including Socrates' lie detector and the intellectual scalpel that dismantles any opinion in minutes. Can you spot when someone is pretending to be intelligent? It happens every day. Someone cites, research proves, experts agree, or science confirms. And suddenly you feel small, as if their opinion is worth more because there's a mysterious authority behind it. You go speechless, thinking, who am I to question the experts? Socrates faced precisely this in Athens. The city was full of sophists, teachers who charged fortunes to teach rhetoric and philosophy. They had all the quotes, all the references, all the big names, seemed brilliant, and were respected, until Socrates asked a simple question. When Protagoras, the most famous sophist of his time, declared, "Man is the measure of all things," citing decades of study, Socrates simply asked, "How do you know that?" Protagoras explained his methods, his sources, his years of experience. Socrates continued, "But how do you know that your methods are correct?" In 20 minutes. The most respected intellectual in Athens was admitting he actually wasn't sure about anything. Socrates discovered that most people confuse authority with truth. Someone speaks with confidence, cites impressive sources, and we automatically assume they know what they're talking about. But authority is not an argument, it's just noise disguised as wisdom. Next time someone bombards you with studies prove or experts say, you'll do exactly what Socrates did. Ask which studies, which experts, how did they reach this conclusion? Most of the time, the person won't know how to answer because they only heard it secondhand. Socrates never lost a debate with this strategy, not because he was always right, but because he forced people to admit they didn't know as much as they pretended to know. But detecting lies is just the beginning. What happens when someone resorts to personal attacks? That's when you need the second weapon. Take the strongest opinion you hold about anything: politics, relationships, work, anything. Now imagine someone asking you 5 simple questions about that opinion, and you discover you can't actually explain why you believe it. Not a comfortable feeling, right? That's what happened to Euthyphro, a young Athenian who was absolutely sure of what piety was. He was so confident that he was about to prosecute his own father for impiety. He really seemed to know what he was talking about. Socrates met Euthyphro on the steps of the courthouse and got curious. "Explain to me what piety is," he asked. Euthyphro replied without hesitation. "Piety is doing what I'm doing, prosecuting those who commit injustice." First, Socratic question. "But that is only an example. What is the general definition of piety?" Euthyphro tried again. "Piety is doing what pleases the gods." Second question. "But the gods disagree among themselves on many things. How do you know what truly pleases them?" Third question. "Do the gods love something because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it?" In 40 minutes, Euthyphro was completely lost and left the conversation admitting he did not know how to define what he had been so sure he understood. Socrates performed an intellectual surgery there. He did not attack Euthyphro, he did not call him ignorant. He merely asked for specifics, forcing the young man to explain in detail what he had assumed he knew. Most people live with vague general opinions. That person is selfish. This is unfair. That is wrong. But if you ask them to define selfishness, injustice, or wrongness, they stumble because they never stop to think specifically about what those words really mean. Socrates' strategy is direct. Whenever someone uses a vague term or makes a broad accusation, you will ask for precise definitions. What exactly do you mean by that? Give me a specific example. How do you define this word? Most of the time, they will realize they cannot clearly explain what they defended so passionately, and when that happens, their argument collapses on its own. Socrates used this approach for 70 years, and never found anyone who could precisely define concepts like courage, justice, or wisdom, not because people were stupid, but because it is much easier to use big words than to understand what they truly mean. Now you have 2 weapons: detecting when someone doesn't know what they're talking about, and forcing specificity. But there is a third tool, even more powerful, one that plants your ideas in the person's mind without them realizing it. Socrates would ask a question, and the opponent would destroy themselves. Have you ever been in a discussion where the other person was clearly wrong, but the more you argued, the more they entrenched themselves in their position? Frustrating, right? You present facts, logic, evidence, and they double down on their error. It seems like the more you confront them, the more stubborn they become. Socrates faced this with Laches, a famous Athenian general known for his military bravery. Laches had just returned from a victorious campaign and was bragging publicly about his unmatched courage. The whole city saw him as a perfect example of valor. Instead of confronting Laches directly, Socrates did something brilliant. He said, "General, I deeply admire your courage. In fact, I'm so impressed that I would love to learn from you. Could you teach me what courage is? Under what conditions would you recognize true courage in a person?" Laches flattered, naturally agreed to explain. He began by saying that courage was facing the enemy without retreating. Socrates enthusiastically agreed and asked, "Then, if someone retreats strategically to a better position, as the Spartans do, would that be cowardice?" Laches hesitated. "No, that would be military intelligence." "I see," said Socrates. "So courage is not just never retreating. Could you give me another definition?" Laches tried again. "Courage is perseverance in difficulty." Socrates agreed again and asked, "But if someone persists in an obviously flawed strategy, is that courage or stubbornness?" In 40 minutes, Laches was completely confused, no longer able to define what he had been so sure he mastered. And the most important part, he was the one who came to that conclusion. Socrates did not attack him, did not humiliate him, did not say he was wrong. He simply asked questions that led Laches to question his own certainties. Socrates discovered something revolutionary about persuasion. People resist imposed conclusions, but accept conclusions they discover themselves. When you tell someone you are wrong, all their mental defenses activate. But when you ask questions that help them discover an inconsistency on their own, they cannot defend themselves from themselves. The approach is this: instead of saying the person is wrong, you will ask, under what conditions would you change your mind? What evidence would convince you otherwise? How would you define your position? What examples confirm or disprove it? You are not attacking their position. You are genuinely curious about the criteria they use, and when they try to explain those criteria, they often discover they are contradictory or insufficient. Socrates turned opponents into partners in investigation. Instead of me versus you, he created us versus the problem. The person stopped defending a position and began exploring the truth with him. Imagine someone screaming that you are ignorant and you calmly respond. Seems impossible, right? Especially when the person is red with rage, pointing their finger in your face, calling you every name. Your instinct is to fight back, to shout, to show you won't take insults, but that is precisely what brings you down. Marcus Aurelius governed the largest empire in history for 19 years. He faced rebellious generals, treacherous senators, and barbarian invasions. You know how many times he publicly lost his temper? 0, not because he didn't feel anger, but because he understood something fundamental about conflict. When someone goes for personal attacks, they have just shown they lost the argument. Think about it. If they had a strong point to defend, they would focus on that. But when they abandon logic and go for your stupid, you know nothing, they are signaling desperation, trying to drag you to the emotional arena because they lost in the rational one. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, today I will meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and bad-tempered, but I will not be surprised or disturbed, for I cannot imagine a world without such people." He mentally prepared himself to deal with personal attacks before they even happened. The strategy is direct. When someone attacks you personally, you will pause internally, breathe, and think, "Interesting, this person just admitted they have no more arguments." Then you will completely ignore the personal attack and return to the original point. I understand you're frustrated, but getting back to what we were discussing, Marcus Aurelius used this constantly in the Senate. Senators would publicly insult him, question his ability, throw personal jabs. He would not react. He kept his focus on the real issue. And invariably, the person who lost their composure ended up looking like a child having a tantrum. Is not passivity, it is absolute control. By not reacting emotionally, you force the other person back onto the field of reason. And if they cannot return there, it becomes obvious to everyone that they have nothing substantial to offer. Now you know how to defend yourself from emotional attacks. But what if you need to go on the offensive? Here comes an approach that Nietzsche mastered like no one else. There is a word that Nietzsche used to control any conversation before it even began. A word so simple that the other person didn't realize they were being influenced. They would accept the premise automatically, and from there all conclusions would follow the path. Nietzsche wanted it is like planting an invisible seed that grows inside the other person's mind. In 1882, Nietzsche was debating morality with Paul Ricoeur, a philosopher who argued that certain acts were objectively good or bad. The discussion was heated, represented solid arguments, cited historical examples, used impeccable logic. Then Nietzsche said a sentence that changed everything. "You are talking about values as if they were discovered, not invented. Did you catch that?" Ricoeur tried to argue that moral values were discovered through reason and experience, but Nietzsche had already planted the crucial word, invented. From that moment on, the entire discussion revolved around the premise that values are human creations, not eternal truths. We spent the rest of the conversation trying to prove that values were not invented but was fighting on the very ground Nietzsche had created, without realizing it. He had accepted that the central question was discovered versus invented, when in fact that was precisely Nietzsche's worldview. This is what philosophers call an infiltrated premise. You introduce your conclusion disguised as a neutral starting point. The person accepts it without question, and that's it. You have already won the debate before it begins. It works like this. Instead of saying abortion is murder, you say when someone kills a baby. The words kill and baby already carry your moral position. Instead of discussing wealth redistribution, you say taking other people's money. The word taking already implies theft. Nietzsche was a master at this. He wouldn't debate if God existed. He would talk about the death of God and post-Christian values. The very words assumed the religious era was over. Anyone wanting to defend religion had to first prove that God was not dead, automatically putting themselves on the defensive. The strategy is to choose words that already carry the conclusion you want. If you want to criticize someone who donates a lot of money, do not say he is generous, say he needs to be loved. If you want to praise someone ambitious, do not say he is greedy, say he has vision. Words shape thought far more than we realize. When you control the vocabulary of the discussion, you control where it will go. Nietzsche knew this. That is why his ideas were revolutionary, not just in content but in the way he presented them. Now you know how to plant ideas subtly, but what if you need to be more direct? Here comes a strategy that Schopenhauer mastered better than anyone. The best defense in arguments is not to defend. Sounds contradictory, doesn't it? You're in a debate, someone attacks you, and your first reaction is to counterattack, to justify, to explain, to say it's not like that. But that very reaction is what traps you from the moment you start defending yourself. You are playing on the opponent's field. Arthur Schopenhauer learned this the hard way in 1818. He had just published The World as Will and Representation, his masterpiece. He was convinced it would revolutionize Western thought. But when critics attacked it, he made a fatal mistake. Instead of ignoring irrelevant criticisms and focusing on the essential, Schopenhauer tried to rebut every single objection. Someone questioned a comma. He wrote 3 pages explaining the grammar. Another criticized a minor example. He wasted energy defending an analogy that wasn't even central to his argument. The result, truly revolutionary insights were lost in a war of insignificant details. The work that could have changed philosophy was ignored for decades, not because the ideas were weak, but because Schopenhauer diluted his force by trying to defend points that didn't matter. It was only at age 50, publishing Parerga and Paralipomena, that Schopenhauer had learned to choose his battles. Critics attacked irrelevant aspects of his work. He ignored them completely, focusing only on defending the central core of his ideas. The book became an instant success. The strategy is simple but revolutionary. Before defending anything, you will ask yourself, is this essential to my main argument? If it is not, you will not waste energy on it. You will let the comment pass and return to your central point. When someone criticizes a specific word you used, or a detail or a minor point in your position, you will not bite the bait. You will say something like interesting, but getting back to the main point, and redirect to what really matters. Schopenhauer realized most people try to drag you into peripheral discussions, precisely because they cannot attack your central argument. It is a distraction strategy. They know that if they can make you waste energy defending trivialities, you will tire out and forget to strengthen your really important points. Choose where to fight. Defend only what is essential. What cannot be attacked, everything else is noise trying to pull you off focus. Now you know the most powerful techniques in history, but mastering these tools brings responsibility that few people think about. Machiavelli won without seeming like he was fighting. Here is the problem with all these strategies you just learned. If you use all of them at once, you will look manipulative. If you detect lies, demand specifics, stay emotionally calm, and still ask Socratic questions all in the same conversation, the person will realize they are being worked, and then you lose all your credibility. Machiavelli faced precisely this dilemma when he returned from exile in 1513 for 14 years. He had been the secretary of the Republic of Florence, negotiating with kings, popes, and emperors. He knew every diplomatic trick possible, but when the Medici returned to power, he needed to win back influence without seeming threatening. If he used all his political skills openly, he would be seen as a dangerous manipulator. If he didn't use them, he would be irrelevant. The solution Machiavelli developed was brilliant. Use only one strategy per conversation, and always in a way that seemed natural and spontaneous. With Lorenzo de' Medici, he never confronted directly. He simply asked genuinely curious questions about the family's political decisions. How do you keep the loyalty of the merchants? What criteria do you use to choose allies? Lorenzo loved explaining the Medici's wisdom and, without realizing it, ended up revealing the weaknesses of their strategy. With other members of the court, Machiavelli used historical examples to plant ideas. Instead of criticizing a current policy, he would tell how Cesare Borgia had faced a similar situation and what methods he had used. People came to their own conclusions about what should be done. The supreme strategy is this: map out the conversation before it even begins. You will decide which approach to use based on 3 factors: who the person is, what the context is, and what your objective is. One strategy per conversation. Always, if it's someone who appeals to authority a lot, you focus on exposing non-arguments. If it's someone very emotional, if you practice the Stoic armor. If the person talks in generalities, you push them to specifics. But never use 2 strategies in the same conversation, because then it feels artificial. Machiavelli also realized that timing is everything. There's no point using the right strategy at the wrong time. If the person is extremely emotionally activated, it is not the moment for Socratic questioning. If they are calm and collaborative, it is not the time to expose their lies. First you read their emotional state, then you pick the tool, and always let the person feel intelligent. Machiavelli never made anyone look stupid, even when he dismantled terrible arguments, because humiliated people become enemies. People who feel valued become allies. True mastery is not showing that you know these strategies, it is using them so subtly that the other person thinks they had their own brilliant insights during the conversation. That you are simply a great listener who asks interesting questions. Machiavelli won back all his political influence with precisely this approach, not because he was the smartest in the court, but because he was the most strategic. But power without wisdom is dangerous, and there is a crucial warning that the great philosophers left for anyone who masters these strategies. You now have in your hands tools that can win practically any discussion. You can detect when someone doesn't know what they're talking about, disarm emotional attacks, force specifics, subtly plant ideas, and turn opponents into collaborators. It is tempting to use this in every conversation, to show off your intellectual superiority, to never lose an argument again. Nietzsche did that, and nearly destroyed his own life. In his youth as a professor in Basel from 1869 to 1879, Nietzsche had developed extraordinary skill for dismantling arguments. He could find contradictions in any position, question assumptions no one noticed, ask questions that exposed the ignorance of others. Intellectually, he was unbeatable. The problem is that he did not know when to stop. Nietzsche used these abilities. With colleagues, with friends, even at dinner parties. Someone would mention a political opinion. He'd break down the assumptions. If they talked about art, he questioned their aesthetic criteria. If they discussed religion, he exposed theological contradictions. The result? He was gradually isolating himself. Colleagues stopped inviting him to events. Friends began to avoid him. Even Richard Wagner, his intellectual mentor, broke ties with him. Nietzsche had become an unbearable person to be around. In 1879, at age 35, he had to retire from the university for health reasons, but the physical problems were only part of it. Nietzsche had created a social vacuum around himself. He spent the next 10 years of his life practically alone, writing in cheap boarding houses across Europe, having minimal significant human contact. It was during this forced isolation that Nietzsche finally understood his greatest lesson. Winning every argument is losing every relationship. Debate strategies are tools, not your identity. You use them when needed, not just because you can. In his last lucid years, Nietzsche developed what he called amor fati, love of fate. Part of that was accepting that not every conversation needs to be won, that some discussions are for learning, not for dominating, that relationships are more valuable than intellectual victories. Wisdom is knowing when to use these strategies, and when not to. Use them when someone is being deliberately dishonest or manipulative. Use them when important issues are at stake. Use them when you need to defend yourself against unfair attacks. Do not use them just to feel superior. Do not use them to humiliate people who disagree with you. Do not use them to show off how smart you are. And never use them with people you love, because in the end, you can win every argument and lose every person who matters. Nietzsche paid that price. You do not have to. On the last day of his life, drinking the hemlock in his prison cell in Athens, Socrates made a surprising confession to the friends who visited him. He said that during 70 years of discussions, he had discovered only one thing for certain, that human wisdom is worth very little compared to the vastness of what we do not know. I spent decades asking questions, said Socrates to Crito. Every answer I found led me to 10 new questions. Every certainty I tore down revealed 100 uncertainties I didn't even know existed. I did not become wiser by finding answers. I became wiser by discovering the depth of my ignorance. That is the most radical revelation of all. These strategies you learned are not just for winning, they are mainly for learning. When you detect that someone is using not arguments, you discover where your own logic might be failing. When you force specifics, you realize where your own ideas are vague. When you ask Socratic questions, you explore unknown territories of knowledge. Socrates used his methods as tools of investigation, not weapons of domination. Every conversation was an experiment. Every debate was an expedition into unexplored territory. He won discussions not because he wanted to be right, but because he wanted to get closer to the truth. The supreme irony is that the more you master these strategies, the more you realize how much you still need to learn. When you can easily dismantle other people's arguments, you become more sensitive to the weaknesses of your own arguments. As you develop intellectual precision, you see more clearly where your own thinking is imprecise. Socrates discovered that the true victory is not convincing someone that you are right, it is discovering together with them where you are both wrong. It is turning adversaries into companions of inquiry. It is leaving a discussion knowing more than when you entered, even if that means discovering you knew less than you thought. In the end, the most powerful argumentation strategies are also the most effective tools of intellectual humility. They make you better at detecting ignorance, starting with your own. They make you more precise in questioning ideas, especially the ones you value most. They teach you to ask the right questions, above all about your own certainties. Socrates' final lesson is this: use these tools to grow, not just to win, to discover, not only to dominate, to build bridges of understanding, not just to tear down other people's arguments. Because, in the end, the most important debate is the one you have with yourself, and in that debate, the only real victory is discovering that there is always more to learn.